Hello coders and welcome to another How to Code Well podcast. Today we're going to be talking about static site generators, and I have the pleasure of being joined by Oliver Davies, who is a remote developer at Invika. Hi Oliver, how's it going? Have you had a good week?
I've had a good week. It's nice to be back on the podcast again. Thanks for having me back on.
No worries. So you're a remote dev and you're currently at your own house at the moment. Just finished the day and you're chilling out, having a nice cup of tea. And I am on the beer. So cheers, everyone. It's been one of those. It's been one of those challenging days. Today we're going to be talking about static site generators. Both Oliver and myself have built many static sites using generators, and we thought it would be a good idea to have a podcast and to discuss the pros and cons of using static site generators to build your website. So first of all, we're going to start with what is a static site? What would you term that as, Oliver?
To me, a static site is almost a throwback to the old sites we used to build. It's just with flat HTML and some CSS and some images, rather than having, sort of CMSs or PHP or other languages happening in the background. Just flat files that are deployed onto a server.
That's a pretty good description, I think. Obviously the generators themselves could be PHP or any other kind of language, but it's the output that becomes the staticness. It's the output that is the static site, which obviously is in HTML. So that brings up some interesting questions around the benefits and the disadvantages of using said static site. What benefits do you think, or have you seen in using static site generators?
The benefits, I guess the main one is performance, so that you're not having to rely on database queries being made and pages being rendered behind the scenes at runtime, because that's already happened. So what we normally would have is your Twig templates or your Blade templates or your Vue, depending on which generator you're using, you're going to have that. All that stuff is going to be locally. You run the compile locally, so it just generates your static files for you. So by the time the files end up on your web server, they're just flat HTML. So those are super, super quick to run. Security, I guess, is another one. There's nothing to exploit in this stack. You've got a very simple. You could literally have one Apache server running. There's nothing really to exploit there, I guess. Free. I like free hosting. One reason I like static sites is you just you can host them for free on services like Netlify or GitHub Pages. Or just like an apps and S3 bucket. Or maybe a $5 a month DigitalOcean server. So that's great as well. And then also there's for sites as well, like there's no ongoing maintenance. So if you think maybe for our Drupal Camp Bristol sites, for example, the previous ones we ran a couple of years ago, there's no need for us to maintain those sites anymore. So we don't need to go in and update Drupal when there's a new version. So now I've sort of archived those as static sites. There's no more sort of maintenance to do for them.
So those were originally dynamic sites, is that correct? And then you converted them to static, is that right? Yeah,
so in the case of those ones, they were full Drupal 7 or Drupal 8 installations. And I just, in that case, just grabbed the HTML from them maybe just been literally using curl, if I remember rightly, just to give me the HTML. And stored those as static sites. They're not going through a generator, but they are still served as static HTML on Netlify. Whereas the 2019 one that we were going to do was built through Sculpin, initially just as a static landing page, and then didn't really have the need to change it at any point. So it did the job quite happily. So.
And of course, Sculpin is the PHP static site generator. Obviously, there's many more static site generators available. Sculpin is really, really good. I really do like Sculpin. And as a PHP developer and someone who has worked on Twig and all of the other, lovely things that you can use with PHP, it wasn't a steep learning curve. I could just suddenly jump to it, and it was really, really nice. You install it using Composer, and you can generate it, using the command line on the console. It was great, yeah, fantastic.
Yep.
So
yeah, shout out to Bo Simonson, who wrote Sculpin initially.
Yeah.
And then Kevin Boyd, I think, is the maintainer now.
Right.
Yeah, shout out to those guys.
Yeah.
I mean, I was in a very similar boat. I'd been doing Drupal for a long time before I started working with static sites. And I started using Jekyll initially, which is a Ruby-based generator that GitHub wrote, which is fine. It's probably one of the more popular ones, at least at that point. But yeah, it's very similar to Drupal in some ways, that there's a concept of content types and taxonomies. And as you said, it's using Symfony components the same way the Drupal 8 is. So if I needed to go in and change something, and I did, I could. And yeah, because it's using YAML and it's using Twig, then this is all familiar to me. So that's the reason why I went for Sculpin. Yeah, there's loads of them. Like there's.
Go on, sorry.
Laravel has one called Jigsaw.
Oh, cool.
Jigsaw is Laravel. There's a few Vue.js ones like VuePress. Gatsby is a big one. I know we've talked about Gatsby.
Yeah.
You talked about Gatsby recently. Like Next is one based on, I want to say React. Actually, maybe not. I think it's React. Like there's a whole site that's Static Gen, I think is the website you can go to. And there's just a whole list of them of all these different sort of generators.
Yeah, and they all have different sort of levels of documentation, I find, and sort of barriers of entry, and they all slightly do different things, but the output is the same. So you could build a static site using any one of them. But the thing that blew me away with Sculpin is the simplicity of it. I don't want to say that in a disrespectful manner, but it was just the fact that I could throw something up extremely quickly without having to go to the docs and read a whole new programming mind shift. I really enjoyed using Sculpin. I mean, I used that for the howtocodewell.fm site. That's the thing that it's built upon. Do you know any other PHP-based static site generators?
I think Bo talked about this on some of his early Sculpin talks. I think there's one called Frozen, which I guess is PHPROZ or something, something like that. And then the main other one that comes to mind is Jigsaw, which is built with Laravel components. It uses Blade templating and collections and things. So, yeah, I think they're the main ones I'm aware of from a PHP perspective.
From using Jekyll and using PHP static site gens, and have you played with any JavaScript jobs as well?
I started to look at. I hear a lot of things about VuePress and Gridsome. Like I like Vue.js a lot as well. So those are probably my ones I will go to. Right. I did look at them briefly. I did a talk at the BlueConf conference last month about decoupling Drupal backend and then a Vue front end. So I ended up using just normal Vue CLI to create an application. Right. But yeah, using something like VuePress or Gridsome was quite appealing. So yeah, I need to look at those a bit more, I think. But
so that's interesting because you when you think of I'm going to build a static site, one of the decisions one needs to make is, do I use a server-sided generator or do I use a JavaScript generator, a front-end generator? And I guess, I mean, I still haven't, I guess, really nailed down the reasonings why I do one or the other. Have you ever had any consideration as to thought about, maybe this would be better in, say, Gatsby rather than a PHP one or vice versa?
I think mostly because of the preference.
Right.
I think. I mean, as you said, like they all end up the same in the end. Right? They all end up outputting the same or similar HTML. Like how you get it into that point might be is probably more down to preference. Probably. I mean, I tend to go for PHP because I do mostly Drupal and Symfony, so that would make sense for me. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's some advantage on a speed side. I know, like, I hear a lot about Gatsby within the Drupal community. I've heard a few people that talk about it at Drupal Camp in London this year and other conferences at DrupalCon. So I hear a lot about people using Gatsby front ends and Drupal back ends. I hear a lot about like the speed at which it does things.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether that's particularly because of what it's using under the hood in terms of its stack, or whether it's just quick for another reason.
Well, I was playing with Gatsby. I built a site on it, my personal site, and I was completely and utterly blown away by the speed. It's not, it's. I'm not trying to fuel the hype here, but it was just developing. It was. Because it's in JavaScript, it just manipulates the DOM. So there's no even need of refreshing the page. You could have one page that is the code and the other page that is the design, and because it's completely listening to it and rebuilding itself all the time. It's super quick. So I can understand from a front end's point of view that would be super awesome. However, Gatsby has a humongous, in my opinion, learning curve compared to other generators, because you do need to have a level of React knowledge. If you don't, then it can be quite a daunting task, I think. However, the documentation is amazing. Like you could read the Gatsby documentation, not being a web developer, and understand everything from Git to React very, very easily, because the documentation goes through every little piece of detail that you need to actually develop and deploy the Gatsby site. So yeah, they've really thought about it. Excuse me. And I was quite impressed. One could argue, however, that I could have just developed the whole site. I mean, because it's only it's a single page. So it is. Yeah. I could have just done the whole thing in HTML, to be honest. It would have been the same thing.
Yeah. I was working with my 8-year-old recently. He thinks building websites is cool, and it is arguably. But he likes building these little pages for things, and we use we'll just use a static page, like little index HTML file. We usually pull in Tailwind CSS off a CDN to start building a page. And it's like, he did one recently. It's like, Luke, a picture at the top, but then I play rugby 4, and then there's little sort of like little about me page. It's pretty cool. But yeah, that's still a static site because it's although it's not going through a generator, it's just a HTML site. We could have done that with Sculpin or a Vue CLI or something just as easily. But in that case, if you don't need it to be that, then just do it as a still having, like, where I find a lot of the static sites the generators to be really useful. So when you're having to pass that sort of content, maybe you've got for Twig, if you're using inheritance for templates and doing building loops of pages and things, then it's really useful. But for just a one page thing, maybe it's probably useful as a training exercise still, but as a definitely. I mean, acne on that from that site that I created, I used Gatsby because I needed the potential of hooking into APIs, and I needed to, and I'm not aware of what the API responses are. I know that they're going to be in JSON, so Gatsby was kind of my selling point. It was, can I use GraphQL to import anything I want to manipulate the front end? That was the real selling point, I think, for me. That was the fact that I can integrate GraphQL. And you mentioned something earlier, which is something that I would like to discuss a little bit more, and that was using Drupal as a backend, because that again interests me, because you could use Drupal and then get Drupal to return APIs
So this is a thing I'm thinking about doing with the How to Code Well FM site, is to have a means of a content management system to create guest pages and episodes and all of that stuff. And because it's more relational, the data will become more relational. I can do and manipulate different views upon that, and then send that off to GraphQL in any kind of variant that I wish. And in my head, I'm not too sure how that's going to look. I don't know what the responses of those APIs are going to look like. However, I need the flexibility to do that. One thing that some of the static sites do kind of confuse me on a little bit, and it's probably just my lack of knowledge, is the fact that some of the relational data gets duplicated quite a lot. So, for example, with the podcast site, you have a episode page that has the guest on it, the guest profile image, the guest name, and all that stuff. And then I wanted to have a guests page that would have all of that information on as well. So I would then have to sort of traverse all the episodes to find all of that information out, then create another data structure, and then create a page off of that. And my mind just blew up when I was thinking about the complexities of all of this stuff.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I've hit something similar. That, like, the way I used to structure I've got a page on my website that's about all the talks that I've done. And I remember having the same sort of thought at some point, like, how do I go about structuring this in the same way? And this is maybe one disadvantage I've seen, but is like a lot of logic gets left in the template. And there's a lot of, like, if you're doing Twig, a lot of sets and a lot of for each loops and building up these data arrays in the template almost. I think that's one side of it. It kind of where I've jumped then to putting on my PHP hat and writing some custom. Decided to write a custom Twig extension essentially that aggregates a lot of this together in the same way that I can test, which is nice. And I know then that I'm getting back only upcoming talks, only previous talks, or both. And it does simplify some of the front end logic as well.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of felt a little bit when I was sort of hacking this up. It kind of felt like I was, when you first started learning PHP, at least I did, I was putting in business logic inside the view, right? So the view had lots of PHP tags in it, and it was, and it just felt a little bit like that. It felt like I was putting too much logic into the Twig. And it just felt a bit dirty. And after a couple of beers, I thought, hang on a minute, I need to do this in a better way. There must be a better way to do this. And then I just thought, put it in an API, and then decide what the structure is through that API, and then just have the static site generator to generate the template based on the response. And I think that's kind of the direction that I'm going to push in more.
It's almost like progressive enhancement, to reuse a term, right? If you just need a one-page site, do it as flat HTML. And then if you need something a bit more complex, maybe use like a Jekyll or a Sculpin for that. But again, then if you hit another pain point, that maybe you do want to look at, moving up to the next level or something, maybe that is the decoupled sort of Drupal or something. We've got a bit more control over your data model. But then you're still keeping things separate. So it's not jumping for the most complex solution straight away, but go in there when you need to go there, I guess, is one.
Yeah, I think the thing is with the podcast site, it's not very the way it's set up at the moment isn't scalable, in the sense that every episode has its own piece of logic for the guests and the episode itself. And now I want to somehow create a guest page that does all of that as well. And then I want to have a page that does the most popular episodes. And so, it just gets a little bit tedious when you're trying to work through a massive amount of Twig with if statements and settings, set logic and all that jazz. So we touched on a bit there about disadvantages. Not to say that static generators are awful; they're fantastic. They're brilliant tools. Do you know of any other disadvantages, though?
The other one that came to mind was that people editing this content. Like, you'd have to be more technical in order to do that. Like, I'm quite happy writing in Sublime Text and writing Markdown and writing twig things. But, if you're building maybe a company website, like your marketing team probably is going to want to do that. So yeah, that's maybe where CMS for the WYSIWYG editor and things are going to be more up their street. And then also, it is very Git push deploy driven. Like if you want to add some content or edit something, you need to change it and then do a commit and then push that to Netlify or GitHub or wherever.
Yeah.
Whereas like there's not like again, if you're doing a Drupal site, you go /user and log in and then you change stuff within the browser. Like that doesn't really exist as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
Most of the site generators I'm aware of.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I guess, knowing the person who's going to do the work, knowing their skill level, because, it's actually quite, from a non-web developer, it's actually quite a very technical thing, to do, and yeah, like working on the command line isn't fun all the time. And also with these data structures, you have to come up with conventions. So you get one of those wrong and the page doesn't work. That is an interesting one. Knowing the person or the type of people who or department that is going to be using this stuff.
There's such a thing as like a flat file CMS, which is slightly different. Like you do get a back end, but it just generates the flat files for you. So that's maybe an interesting sort of middle ground. So I know Statamic does something like that. I've seen Justin Jackson talk a lot about that with Transistor.
Okay.
So I've not used that myself, but I know there's some people in the Drupal space doing similar things with as well. So
cool.
That sounds like quite an interesting approach.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
That's maybe also where, rather than having a specific site generator, like the other way I've heard of doing this is there are sort of like modules and plugins you can plug into sites anyway. It's like Drupal has one, I think it's called Tom or Tome, Tome, however you pronounce it. But then that's quite interesting. Is like you could still build your Drupal site and then you run it through this module, which just generates the flat files for you. And that's what you deploy. So in that situation, you still get the nice sort of editor experience of Drupal. And I think, and WordPress has a similar one, but I think it's WP to static, I think it's called. I was looking at that when I did my WordCamp talk earlier this year. So maybe again, we can still have the back end of the CMS aspect, but then something then has to then deploy that. Maybe that's another middle ground, maybe.
Yeah, and I guess that's another disadvantage, isn't it? Every change is a deployment. Yeah, and that can become quite daunting if you've got lots and lots of content, right? You're gonna have to deploy the whole thing again.
Yeah, and you probably don't get a chance to do. Drupal's got a really good workflow. It's a Drupal episode. Drupal's got a really good sort of workflow module built into it, so you can have draft, review, publish. Like you can't really do that with Generator either, because it's once it's there, unless you do something clever with CI different sites. You have to approve merge requests and that type of thing. Yeah, again, that's going to freak out your marketing department again, totally, isn't it?
So this is moving into a segue into a question that I wouldn't mind asking you, and that is because we talked about marketing departments. Not it's not a good idea. Perhaps is there any other sort of area of a website that you wouldn't recommend static sites for? Like, would you not recommend them for, say, e-commerce sites or other types of sites?
Yeah, that's again where I've heard a lot more about the decoupled approach. I've heard a lot about Drupal commerce back end and React front ends or something. I know that the company, I think it's called Sitara now. They used to be Commerce Guys. Got a really big initiative on decoupled commerce. So I think that's because that data has to be stored somewhere. So if you're doing e-commerce, that transaction needs to be somewhere, and it can't be in a HTML file. So it's pushed up somewhere. And And I think that's where, not that I've really used it, but like I know Netlify has an integration with Lambda or with serverless, so you can sort of have static sites that have like functional parts or something like that. So that sounds quite interesting to me.
Yeah,
and maybe that example you just said about most popular sites, static site doesn't really have a concept of what's popular. Like I know my site, again, like each talk that I do has a date attached to it, and then Netlify will rebuild like every night or overnight. And then if a talk was done yesterday, it will automatically move to the previous list. Like, so it's dynamic-ish in that respect, but it doesn't have a concept of popular.
Yeah.
So that's where you want to push that to something like an Elasticsearch or a Solar Index and pull that data back out. And that's where the local side is quite useful. Like your data is stored in JSON or Markdown or from an API, and then the generator is just doing the compiling. So I think that's why I hear a lot about Gatsby again. It's really going to plug into these multiple things. I know there's been, I remember seeing an issue in Sculpin ages ago. Can we support JSON? Can we support X and Y different backends?
Sure.
Jigsaw, I think, does something similar that you can give it like an API URL.
Yeah.
And we'll sort of get data from there.
Yeah.
I hear a lot about Gatsby from like say Drupal camps and DrupalCon. Eli did a talk at Drupal Camp London about a project he'd worked on that was using Gatsby front end, and Joe Schindler from Drupalize Me did one for DrupalCon, which I can find a link to, which is really good. And interestingly, a guy called Preston So, he used to be, I get his job title wrong, I think he'd be director of research at Acquia, moved and now works for Gatsby.
Oh,
so
wow.
He was very big in the decoupled. He did a lot of talks on decoupled Drupal,
right,
with Vue and React and everything. I guess back in March, I think he did the keynote in London this year. I think that was like the last sort of weekend he was working for Acquia before he went to Gatsby. So there's sort of an interesting sort of relationship there. I think especially with Drupal 8.7 shipping with JSON API in core. So I guess this is what you would have played with.
That blew me away. That really did. You could even change the order of the values and the keys, or the keys and values, because I didn't like the way it first output the bits and pieces, so I reordered it, and it was just so easy to do that. It was it blew me away. The thing though that kind of, and being someone who doesn't do a lot of Drupal, I showing my complete naivety here, but the thing that concerned me was having that amount of control. That kind of configuration needs to be stored somewhere, and so I was kind of thinking, well, is that stored in the database? Does this now pose a performance overhead, that kind of thing? But I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it was super awesome to play with. It was good.
Yeah, I think that inclusion of that module now in core is going to really open up some doors for these sort of decoupled headless approaches. And then on the flip side, Gatsby has an integration for Drupal that you can enable, that so it knows how to sort of interpret it. That said, JSON API is like a standard specification, so what it's outputting, even though there's still some Drupalisms in the way it names things, like it's a standard format that anybody can work with. So I think that reopens some doors. And there was talk, or somebody else, I think it probably was Eli, asked the question in London, is there maybe a chance of there's a Drupal demo Drupal distribution called Umami, which is a food magazine website with a lot of demo content and content types and things. Like that would be really great to now JSON APIs in core to enable that as part of that mod by default, and then sort of get a sample, like using that as your data source and putting something into Gatsby. So I think that'd be really cool.
Yeah, that does sound awesome. That does sound really, really cool. So I mean, by the sounds of it, you've used static site generators a lot, right? You've played with all sorts. What would you say is the common mistakes that you've seen when people start using them?
I think the main thing is the same thing you've described, with having all that logic in the template level and that view level, because you don't really have access to sort of, the controllers or ways of entities or anything. So you're sort of left to do that there. And there's a separate distinction in my mind between sort of presentational logic and business logic, and one is fine to have and one isn't so much. And I went through my site a while ago and took out a lot of those loops from like the talks template and moved them into Twig filters. So cleaned up that template a lot. And then meant I could test it as well using PHP unit tests and things, because that's where I'm happy. So that's the main thing I've seen. But then on the flip side, they're just so quick to get started with. I built a client wanted 5 or 6 pages to be built to try the new design. This was the current stuff is on Drupal 8, and this was totally different to what they already had. And I was like, okay, we could build that with a static site, and then within their Nginx configuration, just point those 6 paths to the static sites that the Sculpin was generating. And that was so much quicker, I think, than building it all in Drupal and everything on the back end. And then if you have to throw it away, we could throw it away. But then if we didn't, because it's using Twig anyway, like we could take those and put them into Drupal 8 because that uses Twig. So there was method to the madness.
Yeah, I like that. I like that solution. That's a very pragmatic way of building out that. So you're left with the ground running. That's really cool. You mentioned you mentioned something. You mentioned something there. Okay. You touched upon using testing. You touched on testing.
Yeah.
And how does one test a static site generator, or the output, I should say, of a static site?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the generator itself would have its own sort of set of tests internally that it runs to make sure that stuff gets compiled properly. I mean, from my sort of experience, I've got just normal sort of uptime robot tests on the front end that are doing sort of HTTP requests to check that something is still there, which is good. But again, there's a lot less to sort of go wrong with a static site, because it's not like your database is going to fall over because there's no database. So, but yeah, I mean, for me, I like, you can't really test, at least in my experience, the output of the file as much without doing some funny things. So this is why when that talk, the talks pages got a bit more complex, I wanted to A, clean the template up, and B, make sure I'm only getting the right talks to the right time and things. So because that essentially is just a custom Twig extension. So it's a Sculpin has a concept of bundles in the same way that Symfony 2 and 3 sort of did, and 4 sort of still does ish. So you can write your own sort of custom bundles for it. So I wrote a talks bundle that was for my site that added a Twig extension, and then I'm able to call it a past talks filter. But then that has its own sort of set of PHP unit tests, so I can know that the filter itself is working properly.
Right.
I mean, that said, I wouldn't really test so much the output of the page anyway. I'm more concerned about, like, is the right data being passed into the page, rather than is it getting. Otherwise, you just start doing like XPath weirdness things to go, how many H2s there are on this page.
Yeah, I guess you fall into the mode of more of an acceptance test to make it acceptable. Like you said, is it a 200 OK? Does it have the right title? Yeah. Does it have the right content in that? Yeah. And I guess looking upon the decoupled approach, you're separating the concerns. So the data is being tested at the back end, perhaps in a completely different manner to how the output is going to be tested. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I say, my site, again, because it's PHP, I can still run PHP code sniffer, PHP stan, PHP unit. Obviously, like I mentioned, I ran some bhat tests on the actual output as well to check certain pages get in the right select, the active link is the right one and that type of thing. But yeah, this is something I was thinking of before the BlueConf talk. Is that the backend logic has its own sort of tests, be that in Drupal or Symfony or whatever. And then you could start. Like I was playing a lot with VCLI earlier in the year. I've been using a lot of Tailwind CSS recently, and I've seen Adam Wellen do rebuilding of UIs like Netlify and other things using Tailwind, which is pretty cool. So I rebuilt some Drupal ones. I did Drupal's default theme in Vue and Tailwind, and also rebuilt Acquia's hosting dashboard, which was pretty fun because I had to use like Vue Router for that, having multiple pages and things. Which I'm still writing a blog post about, which I'll release eventually. But that was quite fun because I can, actually was starting to use Jest for doing the JavaScript testing. So I was able to go out. I sort of did it in a slightly different way. Like I had an API client test, which essentially was mocking out the API. So I was passing through data as just a big JavaScript object. That could be coming from an API, be it Drupal or something. Yeah, so as long as your tests are passing on both sides, then that's fine. But also then you're not having to worry about I need the CMS team to do their thing, because you can still mock out the API on the front end side, and then if that then changes, you can then update the tests sort of accordingly, right? So it removes some blockers if you're taking that sort of approach.
That's a good point. Just touching on that point, just going back a little bit to Gatsby. So one thing that has impressed me is the fact that I can create a representation of a fictional API request, API response, I should say, in JSON, and then use that as an example of what data could look like. So without even building the API, I have an API response in JSON, in their sort of config. And you could run some JavaScript tests on that just to make sure that you have the right thing back. And I guess I guess from the decoupled approach, you're breaking things up to a point where you can put the microscope on the smallest areas. Because I always worried when I started using static site generators, I always worried that I'm giving over too much control to these generators, and I don't really know what's going on under the hood. I just assume it's going to be generated. I must say when I did the npm install of Gatsby, I was a bit worried that the amount of stuff I was downloading just to get a page running. But it's the way of the world these days, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Especially, you can say the same with Composer and everything else as well, can you, to some degree now? I think just the way things are going.
So for anyone else, for anyone listening who is interested in static site generators, did you have any sort of advice as to what to read or what to use first, or what to consider first, that kind of thing? Any advice for new people coming on and building static site generators, or I should say using static site generators?
Yeah, I mean, I went to Jekyll because that sort of was the really popular one, at least at the time. It probably still is, like GitHub Pages uses Jekyll by default. I remember seeing some talks and some YouTube videos on that, which is why I started using that before moving over to Sculpin. I'm not sure what the de facto, I hear a lot about it's like Hugo and Gatsby and all these different types of ones. Again, maybe pick which is the one that's in your sort of tech stack and so go from there. I guess that's probably the one with the least learning curve for you, unless you've got something very specific. I need to do aggregate these things of data from 6 different points, in which case maybe like a Gatsby is going to be good for that. But, maybe if you're a Drupal dev, go and look at Sculpin, or maybe if you're a Ruby dev, go check out Jekyll. Maybe that's because I went down to the Drupal Somerset group again earlier this year and was talking about Drupal, obviously, but then we talked about Sculpin at the end of that. They're just like how quickly you could get I've got a Sculpin skeleton project that I just use for setting up new projects. It's like, okay, we could do Composer, create project, blah, 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 Sculpin, generate, there's a site, and they can work so quickly. So But then, if because you're already familiar with that tool set, like you already understand Composer and Twig and everything else. So maybe stick to what you know initially, unless you've got something specific you really need to cover.
That's some very good advice there. So stick to what you know, because it is a bit like a kid in a candy shop. You go, oh, look at all of these nice flavored static site generators using all sorts of fancy new technology, different JavaScript libraries and so forth. Some are using React.
Just take a look at staticgen.com.
Staticgen.
Static, like it's the whole, probably the whole list, right? But it's hundreds of them you could pick from. So,
cool. Well, that was an interesting chat about static site generators. Is there any other points that you want to raise before we shoot off?
I don't think so. No, I think it's for me. It's a case of use the right thing for the right job, which I think we talked about last time I was on the podcast. If a project is I've taken like full. So I took a site that was like an ASP project that somebody else had written, and then when I ended up looking at it, I think I ended up moving that one onto Silex at the time, so a few years ago.
Oh wow, yeah.
But there was a case of like that functionality.
Yeah,
it's almost like what's the minimum viable solution for that thing? Like, so there's a case of where I've gone and this one only gets updated once a year. We'll do it with a static site, whereas other things might be. It's avoiding that. Yeah, I think we said this last time as well. That golden hammer approach, right? Don't just use Drupal or WordPress for everything.
Yes.
If something is a good candidate for a static site or a decoupled site, then use the right tool for the job. That's a really good point. And a point that I've just thought of is that the output is just a static site. So I'm a very bad case for this, because I created a single page in Gatsby the other night. But at the end of the day, it's just a static site, right? So it's just HTML. Yeah. So if you can get away with just writing HTML, then just write HTML. Yeah, I mean, I found this when I say my son wanted to learn to build a site recently, and we could totally throw him into here's a clean coding book, right? Learn about Solid and all this type of stuff, right? Like for him, like he just wants to build a page and he wants to see his picture on the screen, and he wants it to say Luke's website and whatever, and for him, like that's a really big thing, like typing, and like just P tags and make a paragraph with some text in it. It's like it's a really big thing, and seeing it on the screen. And then like, we want to make that thing blue now. So I'm like, great. So change that class there and make it BG blue rather than, and like you see his face lights up because it's like it's changed.
Yeah.
And he goes into school and shows his friends on his phone. Look, it's pushed onto Netlify as well.
Brilliant.
Right? He's like, look at this thing that I've done. Like for him, it's like such a big thing. And it's like, I'm not going to. So like I could, right? I'm not going to sit down in front like this is Drupal 8 and we're going to learn dependency injection now, right? Lesson 1, read dependency injection. No, like he just wants to learn how to code, right? And I think that's where things like Code Club are really useful as well. That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, definitely. It's having that instant feedback, that small feedback loop, quick feedback loop.
Feedback loop is so important.
Yeah. And I guess using static site generators for small sites is a barrier of entry, because you have to install the generator, you have to learn the generator and all that stuff. One thing though that I've used static site generators for, which I haven't used them. No, I've heard them being used for. Is documentation sites. So when a site gets pushed, maybe it's a backend API gets pushed, off goes a Lambda script or something that triggers a build of the PHP documentation in a static site generator. Is it read the docs, that kind of thing? Which is pretty good, because you're kind of killing two birds with one stone in that sort of deployment process, because you're keeping two sites up. I
figured that as well. Like I think like GitHub, the way GitHub Pages works, it could either be like a root level, this is where my markdown file is or my HTML file is, or you could put it like in a docs directory, which is what I'll tend to use that for, as building PHP South Wales website this week, and I've got some documentation in there, so it'll serve that directory as a site essentially that we could reference as documentation. And yeah, I know like Pantheon, like the hosting company, used Sculpin for their documentation site, which is pretty cool. And yeah, I think like Gitbook is another one that springs to mind. Like I've seen that on websites before. I think Drupal console. I think you're reading the page and you go, oh, like spotted a mistake. Like edit this page on GitHub. And it just takes you to a page. Like here's a fork of that repository, and then you can change it and submit it back. And once it's been committed and pushed, it's live. Then which is great as well. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that is. Well, it's great speaking to you again, Oliver. For those who don't know, Oliver's been on the podcast before, and we've talked a lot about Drupal 8. So I'll put links to that show in the description below. But thank you ever so much for coming on and spending some time with me tonight, Oliver. It's been a pleasure speaking to you again.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, and I'm sure. Come on again and we'll talk about something.
Yeah.
About decoupling or something.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Yeah. Before we go, what kind of social media links do you want to mention?
Twitter, I guess, is where I'm mostly active. I'm just OP Davies on Twitter and pretty much everywhere. GitHub, Drupal.org, everywhere, more or less. Or we can check out it's oliverdavis.uk. It's my website, which is built with Sculpin. So I do a lot of fairly regular blogging on there about Drupal and PHP and testing and Tailwind and various things. So yeah, awesome. I like blogging. I love looking for something and then finding the blog post I wrote for it 3 years ago. That happened to me this week. I was like, I never meant to do this. I wrote the thing.
Yeah, I've come across this issue before and I solved it and I wrote about it. Oh, there it is. Yeah.
So that was great. There's all those links on to my pages are on there as well. Also my YouTube links. I did start doing some streaming since the last time we spoke, which is pretty fun. I need to get back into doing that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do some more streaming. But the first one I did was like an hour and a half stream, and YouTube chopped it into like 6 minutes.
No.
For some reason, I don't know why.
Oh.
But, wow. The last couple I've done all worked, so I need to redo that one. But yeah, I think I'm going to start doing some more streaming about Drupal 8 and testing and some other things. So yeah, take a look and subscribe there.
Yeah.
Get in touch on Twitter, or there's a contact form on my site if anyone's got questions about anything.
Sure.
Always happy to have questions.
Excellent. Well, there you go. I'll put links to those kind of things in the show notes. And thank you ever so much for coming on, man. Happy coding, everyone. Thank you ever so much for watching on the YouTubes and listening on the podcasts. Thanks very much. Speak to you soon. Cheers. Bye.